Hello everyone and welcome to Byju's Exam Prep IAS. So the topic in disaster management that we'll be taking up next is that regarding the disaster management terminologies. So why does this become important? So when you study disaster management, there are certain terms that are very typical to the subject, and to understand the subject, to understand how disaster management can be better, you need to understand those terminologies and how can that be put into practice. So let us start with these. The first one is disaster risk reduction. Whenever I'll be dealing with any disaster like earthquake, like volcanoes, like any human-made disasters like stampede, then I will be talking about this thing called volcanoes disaster risk reduction or earthquake disaster risk reduction. So what does that mean? So it is a systematic development and application of three things. What are these three things? One is the policies that are laid down by the various authorities responsible for disaster management. Then we have various strategies. What are strategies? They are basically the plans of action. What all actions need to be taken and by whom when a disaster strikes or before the disaster has struck. And the various practices that need to be undertaken by the authorities at all the levels and by the other stakeholders like the locals and the civil society. So it includes the policies, the strategies and the practices to minimize the vulnerabilities, hazards and disaster impact in a region. So vulnerability basically means the probability that any hazard will impact any person. So if the vulnerability is high, that means the probability that a person will be affected or the place will be affected by that disaster will be also high. So disaster risk reduction means development and application of policies, strategies and practices to minimize the vulnerabilities to any hazard or any disaster. Let us move on to the next terminology, that is disaster mitigation. Mitigation means reduction. So disaster mitigation means reducing or limiting the negative impacts of any hazardous event. So in disaster mitigation, if we know that a particular place, it is vulnerable to a multitude of disasters like floods, like earthquake and so on. So proper steps will be undertaken in that particular area before the disaster strikes so that the disaster is not as hazardous. For example, in earthquake prone areas, there can be earthquake resistant buildings that can be built. In flood, in areas which are very susceptible to flood, proper planning of the buildings can be undertaken so that the catchment areas of the rivers and of the drainage pattern is not crowded with buildings or with other infrastructure. So disaster mitigation is a pre-disaster step to reduce the impacts of any disaster. Next one is disaster preparedness. Now in disaster mitigation, we are trying to reduce the amount of damage that any place can get before the disaster strikes. Now in disaster preparedness, we know that the disaster will strike. So we are trying to prepare ourselves so that again the impact of the disaster or the losses due to disaster will be low. So it is the basic knowledge and the capacities that are developed effectively to anticipate any disaster. For example, early warning systems, they help us in anticipating any disaster. For example, the IMD, the Indian Meteorological Department, it gives us the early warning regarding any cyclones, right? So, anticipating any disaster, responding to the disaster and recovering from the disaster. Okay, so the knowledge and capacities that are developed before the disaster has struck, to anticipate the disaster, to anticipate how to respond to the disaster, and how the community will recover from the disaster. So this again forms a part of the pre-disaster planning. Next we come to disaster response. So now the disaster response can both be pre-disaster and post-disaster. So it includes that the measures that are taken as soon as possible after receiving the early warning regarding the disaster. So that comes under the pre-disaster phase. So once I have received the information that that particular place will be struck by the cyclone, we can take definite response steps like asking the people or removing them from the places that will be hit by the cyclone. So they can be instead placed in the cyclone shelters. So the response can be undertaken just after the early warning is received or just after the disaster has struck. Some disasters like earthquakes, they cannot be predicted in advance. So in those cases, immediate relief after the disaster becomes a part of your disaster response. Next is disaster recovery. So it includes the efforts that are undertaken by the various stakeholders. These stakeholders can be the government at all the levels, central, state, local government, the civil society, the local community. So the efforts can be undertaken by any of the stakeholders to bring back normalcy to the place and to the lives of the people who have been hit by that particular disaster. So the sense of normalcy, like sending them back to their houses, starting the markets that were previously present before the disaster hit. So the local economy, the local society, they are to be brought back to normalcy. So that is included in disaster recovery. This again is a post-disaster step under the cycle of disaster management. After this, we come to something called structural measures. Now we have already said that in the mitigation, for example, in case of earthquakes, the buildings, they need to be such that they are earthquake resistant. In case of cyclones, proper cyclone shelters must be provided to the people to remove them from the places where the cyclone will strike. So the structural measures, they include the tangible measures that are undertaken to either mitigate the disaster or to respond to the disaster. So they are the numerous physical infrastructure and amenities that are required to manage a disaster. So it includes the infrastructure of the place. It also includes setting up of the early warning systems in that particular area, so that the idea about whether the disaster will strike the place or not and when will it strike can be easily dispersed amongst the people. So with regards to the structural measures, there is something called retrofitting. Now there is a particular place. Let's take an example of Bhuj. So Bhuj was struck by an extreme earthquake in the year 2001. So before that, that area had not experienced any kinds of earthquake, right? So that's why the 2001 earthquake became very devastating for that area. Now, if there is some place that has not experienced a particular disaster in the past, so accordingly the infrastructure of that place is not very suited or not very resistant for that particular disaster, right? And once the disaster strikes, there is a lot of damage. So what can be the step that can be undertaken? So there is something called retrofitting. In retrofitting, there is upgradation or reinforcement of the existing structure. So there is a particular building. So instead of raising that building to the ground and building it once again according to the earthquake guidelines, what we do, we reinforce the existing structure to make it more resilient towards any future disaster events. Okay, so the existing structure is reinforced, and this is called retrofitting. Next, we have a concept called build back better. Now, there was a World Conference on Disaster Management in Sendai, that is a place in Japan, in the year 2015, where this concept of build back better was given. This is another structural concept just like retrofitting. So here it says that to have a better and resilient infrastructure in the recovery and restoration phase is considered as build back better. That means if in a particular place there were some buildings, now these buildings, they were raised down during the disaster. Now when you are rebuilding them, you have to build them in a manner that they become resilient to any future disasters. So the infrastructure that is built again, that needs to be resistant to the any future disasters that can strike that particular place. So either you are building from the scratch. So if that's the case, you have to follow the particular guidelines related to that particular disaster. Otherwise, you need to retrofit your building so that whatever is built it is resistant to future disasters. So that is the concept, the principle of build back better. Now let us come to the non-structural measures. So structural measures are the tangible ones which can be seen, which can be touched. The non-structural measures are the non-tangible measures like the rules, the laws, the policies, the guidelines that are given by the government for the governance of the disaster management. So this includes things like the National Disaster Management Act, like the National Disaster Management Plan and disaster management policies and so on. So it includes the non-tangible measures. So they basically provide guidelines so as to undertake the structural measures. So what exactly is disaster risk governance? So it is a process by which the government officials, the media, the commercial sector and the civil society, that is all the stakeholders when it comes to disaster management. So all of these, they work together at various levels, that is at the central level, at the state level, at the local government level. So all of these, they are working together in tandem with each other at all the levels of governance in order to manage and to mitigate the risks that are related to the disaster. So combined working of all of these forms the disaster risk governance. Now what is required under this? To have the adequate capacity and resources in place in order to prevent and prepare for the disaster. So all of these stakeholders, they should be properly trained regarding disaster risks and how to provide relief immediately after the disaster. And for all of these things, for training purposes, for capacity building, for providing relief, there is some amount of funds that are required, right? So this also requires certain resources that should be kept separately only for the task of disaster risk reduction and disaster mitigation. So that is all about disaster risk governance. Next, we have capacity development. Under disaster risk governance, we talked about capacity development of all the stakeholders so that they are better equipped to respond to any disaster-like situation. So, under this, the government and the community are involved for bettering or to improve their technological, financial, and administrative skills. So, all these skills, they are improved through various programs, through various training schedules, where best practices and innovative practices are disbursed to the various stakeholders so that their capacities can improve, their skills can improve, and so that they can deal better with any disaster situation at multiple levels, starting from the local level to the central level. So, their capacities and their skills are improved through sharing of knowledge and ideas. Next, we have community-based disaster management. Now, the community forms the first line of response after any disaster strikes. So, it becomes very important to integrate the locals, integrate the communities in any disaster risk mitigation and management practices. So, what is community-based disaster management? So, it includes the participation of the locals by using their traditional language. Now, there are many people who have been living in that particular area for generations, and the previous generations, they have faced the similar disasters. So, they have certain amount of traditional knowledge as to how to save themselves from that disaster. A very prime example here is the tribes of Andaman and Nicobar during the tsunami of 2004. So what happened here, that there were certain tribes which knew how to assess whether any tsunami is going to strike or not, and they, before any early warning could be dispersed amongst the people, they moved to a higher ground, and almost all of them were saved from the disaster. So, participation of locals by using their traditional knowledge and skills to manage the disaster and considering them as the first line of responders. So, community-based disaster management does two things. One, consider them as the first line of response and relief. And second, making use of their traditional knowledge so as to reduce the impact of any disaster. So, this is a strategy which enhances any community's ability to identify the risks related to the disaster, their vulnerability due to both the human and the natural disasters, and to develop strategies by the various levels of the government and resources in order to reduce the impact of any disaster. And apart from reducing the impact, in the post-disaster phase, involvement of the community will also be helpful, increasing the speed of rehabilitation and rebuilding. So, community-based disaster management becomes very important because it is the community who is the most affected and who will be most willing to provide solutions for their problems. So that was all about the terminologies related to disaster management. After this, we'll be moving on to what is disaster management, what are various types of hazards, the various types of disasters, how can we reduce the impact of these disasters, and what is the role of United Nations in disaster management at the global level. And then finally, we'll take a look at India and its various policies with regards to disaster management. So I hope you were able to understand these terminologies because this will be very helpful for you to understand the rest of the subject. Thank you so much.